Please be seated. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. We are absolutely delighted here at the Center for New American Security to have as our first event of the new school year, Heather Wilson, the 24th Secretary of the Air Force, with us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Victoria Nuland, the CEO of the Center. Heather Wilson needs very little introduction to this stellar crowd, but I'm going to do it anyway. As you all know, she's come full circle in her career from starting as an Air Force cadet to now running the joint. But equally impressively, she is a real Renaissance woman. She's done it all. You know, she's run one of the premier engineering schools in the country. She was a member of Congress for a decade. She served in the Bush 41 NSC, and for those of you who aspire to go from being a director in the NSC to secretary of something, this is, it is possible, although you have to be Heather Wilson. She started her own business, and near and dear to my heart, she's not only a pilot, she was also a rower, and we just had a little conversation about how fun it is to be out on the river, and particularly out on the Potomac. So we are delighted that she's going to share her thoughts today with us on what the Air Force is going to do in this new era of strategic competition, and how you take the new national defense strategy and translate it, and how you deal with the new coming challenges upon us, and things like Space Command. What does that mean for the Air Force? And so what's going to happen is the Secretary is going to give some remarks, and then our own senior fellow, Susanna Blum, and she are going to have a conversation, and we'll eventually open it up to all of you. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being with us.
Thank you, Tori.
Thanks so much.
Well, Tori, thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. The sad part about being the Secretary of the Air Force is I not only don't row anymore, I don't even fly anymore. It's really, what is wrong with this picture? But it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about a couple of things that are going on in the service, and then we'll just shift into questions and have more of a conversation. But I think it's important for all of us, particularly here in Washington, where sometimes the stories of the day that may drive us long term don't end up on the front pages of the newspapers. And maybe it's time to talk about a few things that, if you kind of just take a pause and think about national security for a second, that are going on that really set the context for things. Last weekend we were all enjoying the last weekend of the summer and getting ready for kids to go off to school and the school year to start again. And at the same time, a flotilla of 10 Russian ships was coming through European waters headed for the Eastern Mediterranean for an exercise. Those exercises are going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. At the same time this week, 300,000 soldiers and 1,000 aircraft from Russia are conducting the largest exercise in 4 decades in Europe. The Chinese, several weeks ago, has publicly announced that they've been practicing long-range bombing runs at distances that could hit the United States. We have returned to an era of great power competition. The National Defense Strategy specifically recognizes it, and it's a reality that's upon us. And as a service, we have to prepare for it. For the Air Force, that means preparing for what we call the high-end fight. If you think about it for a second, when I was on the National Security Council staff, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the United States Air Force went to war in what is now Central Command. And they've never come home. So 27 straight years of combat operations. And we are really optimized for that fight in the Middle East, where we have exquisite control, we have air superiority, where we really have taken people out of units, 10 to 20% of the units in the United States, and rolled people forward onto that mature infrastructure in the Middle East. And that is not the fight of the future. And so we have to shift and not only change the way we organize ourselves, but the way we train and the way we equip for the high-end fight and for the potential for adversaries, particularly in our case, China and Russia. So we have a new national defense strategy, and while it was promulgated in January, it was circulated widely within the Defense Department as it was being developed. So there was a lot of buy-in and a lot of awareness of what was in the National Defense Strategy before it was published. So for the Air Force, the fiscal year 19 budget proposal is influenced by the National Defense Strategy, and the fiscal year 20 budget will be the same. But it raises the question, and it was a question the Chief and I were asked when we testified about the fiscal year 19 budget, which was what does it take for the Air Force to implement the National Defense Strategy? Not what is your budget, which is always constrained by the reality of what the top line of the budget is. We build budgets to a top line amount of what's available, plus or minus. Those of you who worked in the Pentagon understand how all that works better than I do. This was my first exposure to the Pentagon. I successfully avoided it for an entire career until this point. But it is different to say, what is the Air Force you need to implement a national defense strategy? What is the Air Force we need? We should know the answer to that question, because threat drives strategy, strategy drives concepts of operations and force structure. And for the last 6-7 months or so, we have been in the Air Force developing and looking and wargaming that question. What is the Air Force we need? We actually have been tasked also by the Congress to provide a full report to them early next year to look at that question and also look at new concepts of operations, which the Joint Staff are developing. And so we have asked ourselves what question? That question, what is the Air Force that we need for this national defense strategy? When we have developed that, we decided that the unit that matters most for sizing the United States Air Force is the squadron, and particularly the operational squadron. That is, the squadron is the basic building block for the Air Force. It is our most important level of command. It is our most important unit. It is the one where airmen live and train and fight. And currently, we have 312 operational squadrons in the Air Force. Now, to put this in some kind of context, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and I had no gray hair and was working on the National Security Council staff, but when the United States Air Force went to war 28 years ago, we had 134 fighter squadrons, 134. Today, we have 55, after 27 years of continuous combat operations. So those squadrons, those core fighting units, are the fist and the heart of the United States Air Force. And so they are the ones that create physical effects, like bomber squadrons and fighter squadrons and cyber operations squadrons. It is obviously not the whole of the Air Force. There are combat support and combat service support units that support that fist, just as a fist without the body behind it doesn't make a real impact. But when we think about how do we think about implementing the National Defense Strategy, it is what kind of a fist and how big a fist with how much punch do we need. And that's the work that we've had underway. At the Air Force Association conference that's coming up in about a week or 10 days, I will be talking more about this and laying out what it is we think is the size and composition of the Air Force we need to implement the National Defense Strategy at moderate to low levels of risk. Now, I also know, and we also know, that that's not going to cause the United States of America, or certainly this city, to kind of slap their heads and say, golly, we need to do that next year. This is something we know that we're going to have to shift towards over time. But it allows us to say, this is what we think we need to build to execute the strategy that the nation has asked us to implement. So we will be moving in that direction. The Air Force we have is the best in the world. It is the best in the world. And our allies know it, and so do our adversaries. But the National Defense Strategy recognizes that we have adversaries who are innovating very rapidly, who are seeking to influence their own regions of the world, to shape the world towards their interests, which in some ways are contrary to our own and to those of our allies. I would also say that one of the things that has helped tremendously over the last couple of years is not just the increase in the budget size for the Air Force, which we have used to restore the readiness of the force and deal with some major problems, but greater certainty and the move away from sequestration. We now have a National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year that starts on the 1st of October, and we had it earlier than at any time since 1978. We have the prospect of actually also having an appropriations bill done before the Congress adjourns and before the fiscal year starts. That gives tremendous certainty to the Air Force and to our other services, and we are deeply grateful for the bipartisan congressional support that we've gotten to restore the nation's defenses, because we've made progress with the funds that we've been given. And we have tried to put that money towards the restoration of the readiness of the force and to increasing the capability of the force. And some of the ways we've done that, just as a couple of examples, in the end of fiscal year 16, the United States Air Force was 4,000 maintainers short. 4,000 maintainers short. We put up as a priority trying to recover in maintainers. By the end of the last fiscal year, we were 400 maintainers short, and we are driving to get as many, to fill all of our maintainer slots. Now, those of you here who served or are serving in the military know that that means we have a lot of young maintainers. And so we have to season those maintainers and get them experienced so that they become craftsmen at their work and not just newbies on the flight line. But we are moving in that direction to recover our ability to maintain our aircraft. We've increased flying hours. We've increased the amount of money that we're putting into things like spare parts and training. And so we are making a real difference on the restoration of the readiness of the force for the high-end fight. And we are grateful for those things. There is always, of course, the recognition that sequestration is still the law of the land. The Budget Control Act is still the law of the land. And I would tell you that sequestration did more damage to the United States military over the last decade than anything our adversaries have done. We did it to ourselves. And it is still the law. You know, it was put into law with the idea that it was so bad that we would never do this. And then we did it. We need to move beyond the Budget Control Act in the way in which we make choices about our national defense. And we'll have to find a better way. So, to remain the global leader and meet the threats we face, America needs more from its Air Force. And the Air Force is too small for what the nation is asking us to do. And I will look forward to the discussion of this over the next probably 6 months or so as we flesh this out with the Congress and with the public on where we think we need to go with America's Air Force. It's a pleasure to serve. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you again very much for joining us today, Secretary Wilson. I know you've got a very busy, packed calendar, and we're grateful that you've taken the time to come talk to us about these really pressing issues that are facing the Air Force. And I want to start in the same place that you started in your remarks, and that's with the new National Defense Strategy. Mm-hmm. And in the past, you know, the Air Force has often released a strategy document following the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy. I've heard that you don't plan to do that in this cycle. Is that true?
That's correct. And the Chief and I made an explicit decision not to do that. I think in the past, now, sometimes there's a new national defense strategy. You start out with a national security strategy in the United States, and then there's a national defense strategy. Sometimes there's a national military strategy as well. And it's not at all uncommon for the services to say, and to implement that, here's the naval strategy, and here's the air power strategy. Usually that happens for one of two reasons. either the service doesn't really agree with the National Defense Strategy and they try to, justify what they're trying to do in the context of, this larger strategy, or the National Defense Strategy itself is not sufficiently explicit to give real guidance to the services. In the case of the National Defense Strategy that we've been given, it's exceptionally good. It is rich and meaty, and we don't think that we feel as though we had input to it, and we think that it gives us guidance on where to take risk and what to prioritize. So the Air Force has chosen, and the Chief and I directed, that we will fully embrace the National Defense Strategy, and our decisions will be driven by the strategy we've been given by Secretary Mattis.
That's a great credit to the exercise.
Makes things simpler, certainly.
Sure. And so now I'm going to ask you for a little bit of a preview of what implementing the NDS looks like for the Air Force. What are we going to see in kind of the President's FY20 budget in terms of these new CONOPS that you owe to Congress? Can you give us any insight into what's kind of coming in the months and years ahead?
Well, the first thing that we've been guided to do is to restore the readiness and lethality of the force. And we have been doing that now for a couple of fiscal years, although we make a proposal, and then one of the things I didn't really understand when I became Secretary of the Air Force is that you're really working 4 budgets at one time.
Yeah.
We're executing the FY18 budget. We testified in favor of the FY19 budget. I just presented the FY20 budget this morning to the what we call the defense. This is an acronym, but to senior leadership in the Pentagon. And I also yesterday had the FY20 planning choices. So you're working 4 budgets at the same time. And one of the keys to, I think, successful leadership is to keep the themes through the arc of those budgets. Restoring the readiness of the force to meet any fight, anytime. And so readiness is the first priority. The second is cost-effective modernization, and the Air Force has modernization, really a bow wave of modernization over the next decade. Its fighters, the F-35 is a game changer. Its bombers, the B-21, is on cost and on schedule, but we've got to execute that program. Its trainers, its helicopters, its space assets. One of the major themes in the FY19 budget was accelerating defendable space, and the President put $8 billion more into space to meet the threat there. So it is cost-effective modernization is the second element of implementing the NDS. And then the third, which doesn't get talked about a lot, has to do with allies and partners. What are we going to do it's one of the strategic advantages that the United States has that our adversaries don't have. Russia's neighbors are not really interested. They fear Russia more than they welcome their protection. And the same is true with China. You see defense budgets increasing all around the Pacific, not because people are committed because they're afraid of China and to some extent the North Koreans. So we are stronger together, and that's a major theme and something that's driving our planning.
So to stick with the second element you mentioned for just a second, and in your opening remarks, I think you did a beautiful job of making real the threat that we talk about when we talk about the need to remain strategically competitive with China and Russia. You also highlighted the difference in the number of fighter squadrons in the Air Force between the beginning of the Gulf War and today. It's a significant decrease. But I wonder how you're thinking about the balance of quality versus quantity. Your closing line said the Air Force is too small. We don't have enough fighter squadrons, but how are we thinking about the quality of those squadrons, F-15s versus F-35s, for example?
Yeah. Right now, 85% of our fighter squadrons are 4th generation. And so we are not short of 4th generation fighters. And when we've been asked to look at the high-end fight, the real advantage of the F-35 is not just the F-35, it's what the F-35 connects to. And so I think it is the thing that comes out in most of the ways we think about the future is how do all of these things connect? So whenever we're buying anything, the first question is, does it connect? And the second is, can it share? And if it can, it becomes much more valuable. in any kind of a fight. And that is the real advantage of things like the F-35. The F-35 is a supercomputer wrapped in a stealthy aircraft. It's an amazing capability. And so you're right that it is, sometimes it's about numbers, sometimes but it's more about mix and the ability to connect.
Yeah. So I noticed in looking at the Air Force's 2019 budget request that the amount of money that was going into marginal incremental upgrades on fourth generation platforms is about the same as the new F-35 buy. And something that we've been talking a lot about around the office here at CNAS is how do you get to the force of the future? How do you manage the legacy force in the interim, assuming you know what the joint force ought to look like in 2030, 2040. How do you get there? And the fact that China is operating from a much cleaner sheet than we are, then in a sense that the incredibly robust, capable legacy force that the United States has is both a blessing and a curse. So in terms of thinking about the next level of evolutionary versus revolutionary change, how do you manage that balance? Did the 20 PB get it about right, 50-50, or?
Well, I think the way that we think about it is not so much platform specific, and let me give you an example. Take bombers. People talk about, well, do you need, what we need to be able to do is to penetrate protected airspace. There are a lot of different ways to do that. And so we do a lot of wargaming and tweaking of different capabilities, and then see what the right mixes might be to be able to prevail when we need to prevail. And so one of the examples the Chief of Staff uses is, all right, let's take this example of, let's say, the Straits of Hormuz. If you're bringing a carrier through the Straits of Hormuz, you may want to have air superiority over the Straits of Hormuz at the time they're going through. So no country can put a big block of wood over their country and keep air superiority all the time. It's more like Swiss cheese. And our job is to figure out the holes in the Swiss cheese and get air superiority when we want it, where we want it, for how long we want it. I would say it's also not just Swiss cheese, it's more like fondue.
Okay.
So it's cheese, but the bubbles are moving, right?
Yeah.
So we need to know where the bubbles are moving, how to exploit them, and how to maintain air superiority. You don't do that with single platform pieces of equipment. It is a different kind of fight. And so I think the Air Force is really, really thinking in those kind of creative ways.
Okay. Sticking with the NDS for another moment, there are a couple key new concepts in there, one of which is dynamic force employment, which is something that was under discussion when I was still in the Pentagon a few years ago. And we recently saw an example of what that concept looks like for the Navy, in that the Truman Carrier Strike Group returned to its home port, very shortly, 3 months into its deployment. And I was wondering, will the pattern of Air Force deployments change as a result of the dynamic force employment concept, this idea that we want to be strategically predictable but operationally unpredictable? What does that look like for the Air Force?
The interesting thing to me is when they started talking about dynamic force employment, the Air Force is so dynamic anyway. And that's part of our mission, is global reach, global power. We can be anywhere in 24 hours. And how do we do that in a very unpredictable way so that in any kind of crisis you can create doubt in the mind of an adversary that they have real control of the situation? That's what the Air Force does, and we can do it on very short notice. And while the Carrier Strike Group might move somewhere, and you talk about it, well, it came back after 3 months, or they may, how about we generate we generate very quickly and can go to places where people don't expect us to go. So we are inherently dynamic, and I think that creates opportunities under a national defense strategy that says, be strategically predictable. In other words, our allies know they can count on us. Our adversaries should fear us. And to be tactically unpredictable. That gives strength to the United States, and air power does that.
So you would say the Air Force is sort of on the leading edge of that
I
concept?
think we kind of are
just
a
in its
dynamic
nature.
force
Yeah.
inherently.
Yeah.
So it's to us, it's not a foreign concept. I would say that one of the other elements of the National Defense Strategy that people talk about the shift to great power competition. What they don't usually highlight in there, and which I think is important, is that it also tells us to prepare to handle violent extremism at lower levels of effort.
Yeah.
It's one of the other reasons why allies and partners matter a lot in developing the capability and the capacity in our allies and partners. Because we won't be able, certainly not at the size we're at, we won't be able to recover the readiness levels we need to for a high-end fight if we continue to have half the fighter force tied up either on its way, coming home, or in CENTCOM.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting and underappreciated point a little bit. I mean, the headline of the NDS was certainly return of great power competition, but sustained mission in the Middle East at lower cost or in a more economical way was right there as well. And so, what does that mean in terms of Air Force structure? And I'm thinking particularly about light attack and the way you think about the high-low mix in the fleet.
The light attack is we've done an experiment with it, and this is one of the things we're trying to do in addition to restoring the readiness of the force, cost-effective modernization, is buying things faster and smarter. And light attack's a great example. We didn't do 5 years of analysis of alternatives and set out requirements and then do an RFP and so forth. If we had done that, we would still be doing an analysis of alternatives. Instead, the Chief of Staff wrote a single-page letter and 4 pages of kind of what we thought we were looking for. And within 5 months, we had 4 aircraft on the ramp at Holloman to test.
Yeah.
We did a second test this summer, particularly looking at the network, a fully exportable network from the very beginning that light attack could ride on. And by the network, I mean, in your cockpit, being able to connect to a joint tactical air controller on the ground where they can designate a target. It comes up on your iPad or iPad equivalent, and you can communicate there also back to an air operations center. And all of that technology being completely exportable to any country in the world. So it's designed to be shared with allies and partners. We do also believe that light attack may allow us the opportunity to use more expensive and more exquisite platforms like the F-35 or the F-22 for the things they were designed for. Because I really don't think we should be using F-22s to go after narcotics factories in Afghanistan. When we have air superiority, we don't need a stealth fighter.
Is the theory also that it should lessen the cost of flying hours and the burden on maintainers?
The cost of a flying hour of a light attack aircraft is much, much lower. Yeah. But it's what are you using those flying hours to do? Mm-hmm. The other potential thing for us for light attack is we need to we've got a pilot shortage. We've got a plan to recover that pilot shortage by increasing the number of pilots we're training as well as retaining more pilots. But the challenge for pilot training isn't the year of pilot training. It's absorbing pilots into the squadrons. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard to do that without something. It's hard to absorb 1,500 new pilots a year, particularly into only 55 fighter squadrons without something like light attack, because it allows you to absorb and season more pilots and do so more quickly.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah,
aspect.
it's about absorption as much as it is about training.
So speaking of pilot recruitment and retention, the 2019 NDAA gave some new authorities in terms of DOPMA, the Defense Officers. I can never remember what that Personnel Management Act. Yes. The authority was provided by the NDAA are optional, and I just wonder if you and the chief are thinking about using any of those new authorities for promotion and retention, particularly as applied to kind of pilots and maintainers, you said.
We've got several things we're doing with respect to pilots and pilot retention. We've got an experiment underway in the Mobility Air Force, so for strategic and tactical lift, we've opened up the opportunity for a cohort of probably 15 to 20 pilots to take an option at the captain level to fly only. So be it, you know, the kind of technical track. So they don't have to do all the school and residence and all of those things to say, look, what I want to do is have a great career in the Air Force and be an operational pilot. The RAF does that. We're going to give it a try, see how it goes, and see whether that helps with retention. We've also got an experiment underway to give more control to airmen, just as a more generally about their next assignment. So you know, there's a set of assignments that are open. What's your top 5 choices? And then do an optimization program to see how many, instead of just, you know, the computer in Randolph spitting out names and matching people up, actually ask people what their preference is and do an optimization program to get. It's kind of like they do med school, you know, where everybody finds out on one day where you're going to med school, and it's an optimization program. So you get the most people their first, second, or third choice of where they want to go next. We're also trying to give more control to squadron commanders to work with pilots, particularly on assignments that, you know, if you, all right, we need somebody to take a 365-day tour to Central Command. What would it take? What would matter to you? Instead of saying, take it or leave it, get out of the service in 7 days, which we have as a rule now, which to me makes no sense at all with our most valuable asset, which is people. You're going, and if you don't want to go, tell me in 7 days and get out of the service. Or get out of the service. Instead, to say, make this a conversation. And for you, it might be, look, I'll go for 365 if you can guarantee me a follow-on 3-year assignment so my kids can graduate from the same high school. Or how about if we break this up and I do a 180 and you do a 180, and that way I can be back here for my granddaughter's wedding in May. Work with people and give more flexibility to meet the needs of the service and the needs of the airmen.
Crazy idea. Well, good luck.
We also have scrubbed all the requirements to try to reduce the number of positions that say you must have someone who's rated in that position. So there's nothing more frustrating to be the person that finally says, all right, I'll go, and then you go and you sit there and you don't feel like you're needed. If you're needed, there's a tremendous satisfaction.
Absolutely.
But if you're someplace where you really didn't want to go, and then you're sitting there and you're feeling as though they need me 2 hours a day, why am I here? That's really dispiriting.
So sticking in a similar theme kind of on readiness for a moment, you mentioned in your opening remarks the significant budget plus up 17, 18, and hopefully 19 as well. Congress does their job on time for the first time in a very long time. And I wonder, you know, given 3 consecutive years of increased budgets and particularly focused on improving readiness, recovering readiness after the damage of that contractionary period of the previous years had done, what readiness challenges are outstanding? What's it going to take to resolve them, and how are you going to know when readiness is recovered or that the Air Force is ready?
We had a swarm. The Air Force does some interesting things. I think all the services are different, but when you say to airmen, say, all right, bring 50 people together, and the smartest people you can get from across the Air Force, and spend about 5 or 6 weeks really figuring out how do we measure readiness, how do we resource readiness, how can we recover readiness faster. They come together and they start to figure it out, and they actually gave us a really good plan for that. First and foremost, it's about people. We needed to get the maintainers on board. We need to recover from our pilot shortage. So we need to get trained people. We need to get them in the right positions. It doesn't do any good to peanut butter spread a manpower recovery across the service. We need to prioritize those units, those 312 frontline operational units. Those need to be the priority. So people. The second is training, and training not just for a fight against violent extremists, but training for the high-end fight, really getting training to a high level. Third has to orient towards munitions, and we're recovering a lot of our munition stocks. The Air Force was really taking the fight to ISIS and was a big part of breaking the back of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. But that was expending precision munitions. So we have to recover precision munitions. And then there's a lot of weapon system sustainment. So we think that we have a plan that we're implementing. It's got a lot of parts, and the team is implementing a readiness recovery plan.
And so how long is it going to take?
We are a little bit vague publicly about our current state of readiness. I will tell you
Understandable.
that anyone who doubts the readiness of the Air Force to fight tonight is making a mistake, and we are only getting better.
I think I'll sleep better tonight knowing that. I do want to change tacks quickly and talk a little bit about acquisition and acquisition reform. You know, my view, and I think the view of many others who've been watching this space for longer than I have, is that we've been in a near constant state of acquisition reform for decades now. The previous round was principally about improving cost and schedule performance through WSARA, and you know, what we're hearing now come out of Congress, particularly out of the SASC, is about getting faster and more agile in the acquisition process. You know, those goals to a certain extent strike me as mutually exclusive.
Actually, no.
You don't think so?
Cost, schedule, and performance are still very important for running our programs, but cost, schedule, and reducing the timeline on the schedule, getting changing the way in which we're doing things, so that we get capability to the warfighter faster. Those aren't opposed forces. And so we're trying to buy things faster and smarter. And we're taking advantage of some of the new authorities that Congress gave to the Pentagon in 2016 and 2017. And we're stripping years out of programs. And in defense, time is money. And so it does change the way we budget things. We're going to be doing a lot more things faster, but that means you have to do them sequentially. And we're moving out. We're taking advantage of a lot of these authorities, probably a little bit more. We're pushing forward more, a little bit more than perhaps the other services, but a lot more of our budget is in research, development, test, evaluation, and procurement than the other services
Yeah,
do.
absolutely.
So.
Christine Fox made a comment at an event that we had several months ago that inspired this line of thinking for me, that the kind of programs that are really going to make a difference in terms of U.S. technological advantage over China, over Russia, are not the kinds of programs where you can tell at the outset exactly how much they're going to cost or exactly how long they're going to take to develop. And I just wonder, yes, there have been a lot of new authorities. OTA is one that's talked about a lot. But have we done enough to create space in the acquisition process to accept risk in order to innovate?
I actually think that prototyping and experimentation gives you greater certainty on cost. So we've been given these authorities to prototype and experiment. But think about this. If you actually start bending metal and figuring out what is really possible and doing it before you say, all right, we're going to go into a program of record, you know a whole lot more when you make the decisions. So if we do a prototype, rather than doing 5 years of paper studies and making a guess on what the cost is going to be, if we actually prototype, we find out, we're doing this now with adaptive engines. So instead of doing a paper study for 5 years and setting out requirements, we're doing 2 prototypes. Now, adaptive engine is, imagine you've got a Corvette with 8 cylinders, and when you get up to speed, 4 of the cylinders turn off. So you can still accelerate when you want to, but you get good efficiency when you're going at highway speed. We're doing the same things with adaptive jet engines. The goal, we've given to 2 major suppliers, the goal is an engine that has a 10% increase in thrust and a 25% increase in fuel efficiency. Pretty ambitious goals for a jet engine. And we said, see what you can build with an adaptive engine. So they may only get to 9% and 20% increase in fuel. That's, if we had set those as requirements, we would have defined that as a failure to meet the requirement. Instead of saying, build us a prototype and then we'll make a decision, we will have actual data and actual hardware and real stuff to make a decision on for the future of engines. The Air Force spends more money on fuel than anyone in the Defense Department. We spend about $5 billion a year on fuel. What does a 25% increase in fuel efficiency do to the range of your aircraft, your requirement for fuel, your requirements for tankers, all of those things, and a 10% increase in thrust? Those kind of things are great examples of why prototyping can get you the data to make a decision, and it's much better and much more certain than just a paper study.
And so you would say these new authorities that have come from Congress in 2016, 2017 have made it possible to do more activity in that kind of prototyping space, retiring risk
Prototyping and
early
experimentation, and also allows us to do things faster. The other thing that they did was they take a lot of what just before I came about 3/4 of our major defense acquisition programs, our largest programs, the decision level was at the Office of the Secretary of Defense level. That is now flipped, and a lot more programs have been delegated to the services. That allows us to move much more quickly, and independent technology risk assessments are done by, and I've kept nothing at my level. I do not add value when someone comes and asks me for permission to sign off on an engineering program. I know that. So I want to get great program managers and program executive officers, support them, and let them make decisions and run their programs. I want them running their programs, not managing the Pentagon. And that is the mission guidance given by me and by the Assistant Secretary for Acquisition. That allows us to go faster and allows us, I think, to make good decisions at the program manager level. The other thing that we did as a requirement is when we use these new authorities, we want to increase our transparency in reporting. So that we're not saying, you have to come see me and Mother May I to sign off on things. But we want the people who gave us these authorities, our board of directors, if you will, to know more than they would in a conventional program. So we're being very transparent about our results, cost, schedule, performance, and moving faster, but be very open about it. We did a report on every program that the Air Force is running to the Congress last February. We'll do another one in February on all of our results, and we give them periodic updates on every program we're doing.
So you mentioned specifically the delegation of milestone decision authority down to the service secretary level and further delegation from you down to the services. And that certainly saves a lot of time in that it eliminates a couple layers of oversight. Critics would say that what you risk there is losing a joint perspective on some of these major programs. What are you doing to kind of mitigate?
It's interesting you should ask. I think the services are working better together now than they at least that people tell me. So that somebody who works in the Office of the Secretary of the Navy who's been there 18 years and is at least confirmed at least back 18 years. We're working together better. We have breakfast together every 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. We have a whole list of things we're working together. We just signed a memorandum of understanding on hypersonics. Mm-hmm. And we sat around a table with brought one person there as a technologist. And the Army had done an experiment with a warhead that worked better than ours, but its diameter is too big to put on. The Navy has to shrink down the diameter to put it in a torpedo tube, which will take a little longer. So they said, "Do you think you can launch this off of a B-52?" We thought, "I might be able to do that." So we signed an MOU, best technology. Work together, share data, go fast, and so we are working together on that. We're about to sign another MOU on advanced manufacturing technologies, which so to drive down the cost of sustainment. Work together, share information, solve each other's problems. We just used an experimentation and prototyping authority to. There was a potential gap in a Navy communications system, satellite communication systems. We used new authorities given to us by the Congress to close the gap and deliver them a capability 2 years early. So we're working together.
Good news story.
Yeah, get after it.
All right.
It terrifies. We have breakfast together with no staff in the room. Terrifies the staff.
As a former staffer, I can attest that it's
terrifying.
terrifying.
But here's the interesting thing that it caused. People have now figured out that when we have breakfast, and now they're all having breakfast together. So the general counsels meet, the political assistants meet, so they're all getting together. And the installations people, one of the tasks was to look at all our joint bases, see how everything's working, come back to us with recommendations for anything you want to change. Because we think that if the three of us agree on any tweaks or changes on any of the joint bases, who's going to object? So they're all meeting together and sorting out problems. And it creates a really, I think everybody's, it's like, we better sort this out or we'll give it to them, and you have no idea what they're going to do.
Never know what's going to come out.
Right.
Well, with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to our audience for questions. I think we do have a microphone circulating, so if you wait for that to come to you, don't be shy. Sure, just here in the third row.
Afternoon, Colin Clark, Breaking Defense.
Sure.
Are we going to have a subordinate command for Space Command, or are we going to go straight as Shanahan said he wanted to do? And do you have a timeline yet?
The Congress authorized a subordinate command. Under current law, Secretary Mattis has full authority to do that even without a Defense Authorization Act, but the Congress indicated they have a consensus on that as well. The President actually has authority to do a full unified command, but I think the right thing to do, and I think the Defense Department is going to do this, is to talk to the leadership in the Congress to say, would you object if we went directly to a full unified command, or would you like us to step through and go sub-unified and then unified? So I think there will be consultations about that. I think the desire is at least to get it established by the end of the year.
Secretary Madam Secretary, Tom Gould, Harris Corporation. Thanks for joining us today. Really enjoyed your remarks. Back to acquisition reform. As you you gave us some great examples of where we're going faster, more cost effectively, and getting these capabilities to the warfighter. And you gave us some good examples. I was wondering if you could reflect on a couple areas that maybe we could all do better, both from inside the department and outside.
If I did that, that would be probably frustrating to some people. When we have problems, I usually talk directly to the program manager talks directly to the contractor involved. I do think that competition helps, and one of the things we're trying to do is to increase the amount of competition that goes on within the defense industrial base, and the other thing that helps is speed. I mean, one example, there are a lot of companies that won't do business with the Defense Department because we're too hard to do business with. I mean, Harris is used to doing business with us. The big companies, it's not an issue. But for small, innovative companies, it's often an issue. So there are some things that we've done using other transaction authorities as an example. We're setting up consortium. We did one on space. We started it in January. It was oversubscribed, so we actually increased it and put $500 million into this consortium. We send out solicitations, quick response, and the average time from solicitation to contract award has been 93 days. We have signed 14 contracts since January under that, and we've got 188 companies, last I checked, in that consortium. 124 of them are companies that have never done business with us before. So that's another positive example. I would say that there are always problematic areas. One of the problematic areas we've had in the past is software. I think historically, the Defense Department is terrible at buying software. The Air Force is. I think it's pretty universal because we've treated it like a product. And that's not what software is. We can't, any of you here who survived even just computer science 101, if you started the semester and turned in all your projects at the end of the semester and only tested them at the end of the semester, what is the chance that you have a bug in your code? Close to 100%. So that's not the best way to check software. So we need to shift to more commercial practices on software. We're shifting that way, but I would say that's as much our fault on how we buy things as it is, as it is companies, but we need to partner with the companies to shift to development ops. And we're doing that in Boston. We've set up PEO Digital to focus on how we buy software, shifting to development operations or DevOps. And we've set up a little software factory. We're doing things very differently, but we need to be able to do it differently at scale on software. So that's an example of where we're not doing so well, or historically haven't, and we've got to change.
Admiral Haney? I failed to ask you both about the Space Force and the nuclear forces, so I'm going to give a question to Admiral Haney. I'm sure he'll make up for my deficit here.
Secretary Wilson, thanks for being here, and great to hear your remarks on so many things. If you will, given that the Air Force has 2/3 of the triad, and we had the nuclear posture review released here, if you can give us a little bit in terms of how is the implementation going, and not just in terms of the force structure we think about a lot, ICBMs, bombers, but also nuclear command and control.
So I'm glad you mentioned that one, because we do have 2 of the 3 legs of the triad, and the nuclear posture review said keeping the triad is the right way to go, so reaffirmed the importance of the triad. But we always start out with nuclear command, control, and communications, because I think it's a particular area of focus and fragile, and the Air Force has about 75% of the nuclear command, control, and communications. So we are moving forward on modernization of, for us, the 2 of the 3 legs of the triad, with ground-based strategic deterrent and long-range standoff weapon, which is the replacement for the air-launched cruise missile. We're also modernizing the B-52 bomber with new engines, new radar, and other things, and driving forward on nuclear command, control, and communication. I think probably the best thing that Secretary of Defense Mattis has done with respect to command, control, and communication is to put a single person, General Hyten at STRATCOM, in charge of that enterprise, because there's a lot of different pieces, they're in a lot of different services, even in multiple commands, and I think that will help drive what needs to be done in that architecture, and that's a good idea.
Right here, in the second row.
Thank you. I'm Steve Hirsch from Air Force Magazine. I'll pick up the Space Force question. Could you give us an update of the progress on moving toward a Space Force since we had the announcement?
The President's budget will come forward to the Congress for the fiscal year 20 budget in, I think, first week of February is the deadline, or somewhere in there. And along with that budget, there will be a proposal for the establishment of a department and for the Congress to consider. I believe that we can't do half measures. We should put this forward in the right way to make sure that what goes to the Congress can work. And that means that we have a full department with all of the authorities necessary for that to be functional for the long term. And I think we have that obligation. My responsibility as Secretary of the Air Force going over, and the responsibility of all of our airmen, while this national debate takes place in the Congress, is to implement what we've already done in the Air Force. And the President's budget for fiscal year 19 significantly accelerated defendable space and added $8 billion to the budget in order to develop capabilities to be able to defend what we have on orbit and to make sure that we continue to dominate in space. The United States is the best in the world at space, and we need to continue to be so, because every military mission depends on space. So I think this debate will be a good one, and there'll be a greater understanding of what the military does in space and why all of our missions are dependent on it, and why we must dominate in space in order to be successful as a nation.
Let's go towards the back there.
Thank you. Aaron Kiesler, Lewis Burke Associates. As you know, the 12-month-long Air Force 2030 Science and Technology Study is supposed to wrap up this month. Do you know when that's going to be released, and can you comment on any plans that will stem from that?
Thanks for the question. We will release it sometime this fall, and we've done a lot of listening sessions. We're now at really the hard part, which is really the head work on what do we think needs to be a priority? And there's really two parts of the science and technology review. What are the science and technology areas that the Air Force particularly needs to focus on? And this is early stage and early applied research. And the second is, how should we do our research? It's my perception that following sequester, when there was a significant reduction in research and development, particularly early stage research and development, we also turned inward. And there's not enough internal competition for projects. It's kind of there's a standing army. And that's not the best way to really drive forward a science and technology portfolio. So we're looking not just at what are we going to prioritize for research, but how do we conduct our research in order to continue to rapidly innovate and drive forward. So it'll be sometime this fall, but I think we are right at the point where it's like any big project, right? You spend the first 80% of the time gathering huge amounts of information, and then you've got to figure out how to really boil it down and make some important strategic decisions. This is the hard part right now.
And last question right here in the third row.
Secretary, thank you for being here. Esther Babson with the American Security Project. As you modernize and simultaneously maintain readiness and lethality, how do you view and how are you preparing for some of the non-traditional long-term security threats, such as rising seas or extreme weather at places like Langley and Eglin?
For us, those kinds of things are a civil engineering kind of issue, so we deal with those issues kind of base by base. I think that's probably the way in which we address those kinds of issues particularly.
Secretary Wilson, thank you again very, very much for taking the time to be with us today. For everyone in the audience, I think we'll let the Secretary depart, and then I unfortunately have to ask if you could clear the room with some haste, as we have another event on the back end of this one. Thank you all for coming. Thanks very much.
Thank you.